Hello and welcome to another episode of Everything Digital Health. Today I'm joined by Alan Hassey, who is a GP that I've known for many years through the kind of informal network of GPIT specialists that there are out there. Alan's now retired and lives up in Yorkshire, which is where I also live and is the best place to live, I think. It's also, it's a lot of health IT people come from Yorkshire, don't there? There's a lot of health IT innovation come around from Yorkshire. But Alan, do you want to tell us something about yourself and how you got from medical school into informatics?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for inviting me, Marcus. So I'm Alan Hassey. I was a GP in Skipton for 31 years. My path into informatics was kind of mixed up one, really. Nothing much to do. There wasn't a computer I was ever aware of at medical school when I was in Newcastle from 1973 to 78, but I did discover one during a registrar project. There was a terminal, and I was able to punch some cards and delve into the depths of SPSS in the Newcastle University computer. So that was my first introduction to IT. I got a little bit more interested when things like programmable calculators and then a series of Sinclair computers came out and started playing with those.
I remember those.
Yeah, well, they were toys really, but they were great fun and taught me a little bit. Apart from how to program Hangman, I discovered a few other programming tricks. But my route into GPIT informatics was obviously mostly as being a clinician and an educator as a GP trainer and educator. A little bit of research, but not really that much. And the kind of informatics side of things where I, because of my interest in IT, I was asked probably in the late 80s in what was then do you remember FHSAs and FPCs, all these weird structures that used to exist in primary care? Well, I was invited.
I qualified.
Yeah, before, I thought it might be before you were born, Marcus. But it was a case that probably the big change, I think, was the GP Contract 1989-90 introduction of GP fund holding. And suddenly practices were starting to computerise. And the FHSA, Family Health Services Authority, or the FPC, whatever they were at that stage, knew I was interested in IT, asked me to write a job description for a GP computer facilitator, which I did. I liked the job description so much, I applied for the job and got it. So I was the North Yorkshire GP computer facilitator from about 1990 to 2000. And that was my introduction to the world of IT. There was very much a kind of educational component to that because I'd been a trainer, became a trainer quite quickly about 1986, 87. And a lot of what we were doing at that time, there was just a vast marketplace of GP systems, maybe up to 100 at one stage.
That there were a lot of them, kind of homebrew ones and sort of small companies and local.
They would come and go. But so many of them were GP driven, and often they were bespoke systems that worked in one practice only. So I had the great privilege of travelling around North Yorkshire, visiting all these practices, including a little practice in the far northeast corner, which was building a system in Egton. This turned into the Egton Medical Information System, EMIS.
Yeah.
But there were many other systems, and it was a great privilege. You'd go out there theoretically as an advisor, but I always came back learning something. And I think that was where I first kind of got the thing about lifelong learning. So that kind of reinforced my educational interest and credentials. So as a clinician, I started to do stuff around diabetic registers, got very interested in all of that. I started to summarize my records. I summarized them onto a Sinclair QL computer with a horrible little micro drive, which was always at risk of losing my data. And actually
discs.
But presented to my partners some information, because we thought we were a very, very good practice. I think we were. But the partners were convinced that we had 100% uptake of spical cytology and childhood IMS. And I was able to show that we didn't, that actually cytology rates and vaccination rates were only in the 80% level. And so they began to see that information systems, apart from the old RCGP card index system we had, that was our first age sex register, that there might be some role for computers. So there I was at this stage being a clinician, being a diabetic lead, getting interested in all of those things. Got interested in privacy issues very quickly when I shared our diabetic register with a local diabetologist, told one of my diabetic patients about it, who was appalled that I'd shared clinical data without consent. Slap on the wrist, very early one. Yeah. So I thought, maybe I need to think about this a bit more. So we started developing information leaflets for patients on how we used and shared their data. And that attracted the interest of someone called Fiona Caldicott in 1997, and the first Caldicott report and the output of Caldicott principles.
So this is all like at the very start, really, of having to think about data in a different way, because before that it was written on pieces of paper. The pieces of paper were locked in a cupboard in a GP surgery, and we've moved to a world where it's data on disks, and it can be moved and copied, and it's difficult, I think, for people growing up in this era of data to imagine what it was like and why no one was thinking about the privacy side of things until there was a conscious effort to actually approach it, to confront the issues.
We had I got quite interested in this quite quickly, because we bought a computer system from another practice that were upgrading, and they delivered their computer system round to us, and I was about to set it up and realised they'd also provided me with their entire patient database, including some quite detailed medical records. So I said to them, do you realise you've done this? They said, well, we didn't have time to clear it all down, but we trust you, we think you'll probably sort it out for us, but you won't tell anyone, will you? So I was thinking,
can't imagine that happening now.
Work to be done on the privacy front that we need, and confidentiality, and think about it, because we were worried. People were quite rightly just beginning to worry about what it meant to go from an individual approach where you had a Lloyd George envelope where, if you were lucky, you could actually find some content that was relevant and maybe read what somebody else had written. But there was absolutely no chance of it going anywhere unless you left it in the car or on top of the car roof or something on a visit. To suddenly having a population approach to general practice. So I was also doing a little bit of research at that time. So all of these things came together with me being interested as a clinician, fundamentally, trainer and educator, began to do some courses for GP trainers, with another of my successors as HIG, the Health Informatics Group chair, and that was Paul Robinson, who was a GP in Scarborough. And
another Yorkshireman.
Another York, of course. But I think there was actually a very strong northern component, because, of course, there was the Newcastle Gateshead axis as well, with the Impervious and
Neil Jones.
Theo was a Yorkshireman as well, but there was Nick Booth and a few others up in the northeast. So there was within 100 miles, there were quite a lot of.
And of course, both Demise and TPP are based in Yorkshire.
Just around the corner
Digital,
from us, actually.
HSCIC, NHS Digital, all of that was, and so the spine central services kind of thing, they're all based in Yorkshire.
Yeah, but that followed on. That was a few years later, really. But so those are the kind of things I got interested in, and then as I sort of began to take a more of an interest in trying to build a network, I got attracted into this group of chaps. It was overwhelmingly chaps at that stage, based in London, but again with a strong northern component. That was the Health Informatics Standing Group of the Royal College of GPs at that stage, with Tom Davis as the chair I first met, but closely followed by really, I think, important figures in our world of clinical informatics at that stage: Ian Purvis, Leo Fogarty, John Williams, and others. So a real cadre of mighty informaticians to learn from, which made me feel much of an imposter because these guys all knew a lot about all sorts of things. And I wasn't really a coder, or I was suffering from an acute bout of kind of imposter syndrome at that stage.
So I think that's quite normal. When you're in a group like that, I remember my first foray into the Health Informatics Group, and Peter Short was showing me around, and I went to the pub with John Williams, and in some ways I hardly knew who these people were because they're not famous. They don't have a national profile, but they have an importance within the system. But then, as the more I learned, the more I realized how much there was to learn, and it becomes this: you're staring at a cliff face that's right in front of you, and it's vertical climb to learn this stuff. Not really helped by the fact that there isn't much out there to learn from. A lot of the knowledge is inside people's heads or inside organizations.
Well, that's where I think I sort of came in. I identified a gap, which was, how do I get from where I am to where they are? And the educationalist in me started to think about ways I could contribute to that. And as I've already said, being a completer finisher meant that I was quite keen to take on some projects and see them to completion. So the kind of thing where I did sort of get involved was in a series of projects we did, and we got funding for under the auspices of the Health Informatics Group. So that was Scope EPR, the Shared Record Professional Guidance, Good Practice Guidelines, version 3, 3.1 and 4, which are really important, and actually I think are still important because GPG V4 legitimised the holding and using of GP electronic patient records. It talked about how to keep and maintain audit trails. And it talked about record retention, records standards, interoperability, clinical safety, things that would be made explicit. And actually, while it may have been a sort of bookshelf document for lots of people, it was picked up by suppliers, particularly by the informatics community, and crucially by our parent bodies and the Department of Health and its relevant agencies at that stage.
So I'll make sure I link to it, because the GPG version 4 is hosted on the internet on my GitHub account, because there was no sort of proper place for it. But the GPG V5 has been updated a little bit, hasn't it? So there is a version, and I know the team within NHS England were very keen, due to pressure from the HIG, to revise it and update it. So there is a version. I'll put links to both of those. I think they're slightly different documents in tone, but at least it's not been dropped.
No, I don't. I think part of the problem is the lack of professional ownership. So the previous versions were always signed off by the Royal College of GPs and the BMA, and they would be signed off at the highest level. And I don't think that happened with GPG V5. And we would always have editorial control. Again, I don't think that happened anyway. We don't need to focus on that too much. But
I think it's an important theme that there does seem to have been an attrition of the role of clinicians in making decisions about data as the last 15 years has played out, really. I feel as though when I joined the Health Informatics Group, it was listened to a lot more. There was a lot more central attention paid to the decisions that were made, and by the joint GPIT committee, which is a sort of related BMA RCGP group. And now those groups seem to be quite under-resourced. They're not really funded. No one seems to know about them. I mean, I was involved in a conversation just a couple of days ago where NHS England were looking into adding QRisk into GP systems, QRisk 3 this is, and I had to tell them that there is a group that has been trying to do this for a decade and has still not been able to do it because of the multiple blockers and everybody pointing at everybody else and saying they're the issue. That we need to sort of, as a profession, we need to regain a bit of control, really.
Yeah, and you and I were slightly different generations of chairing that group, but we probably had the same conversations with our respective councils in college.
Yeah,
which was to get to know them, try to win them over, tell them who we were. And we were, we had our ups and downs. In 2004, when I took on the chair, we had a very tricky relationship with the then chairman of council, made more complex by the appointment of two GP computer advisors who were very senior figures, one from the college and one from the BMA. And
I see.
It was tricky times. The politics were hard. I found it very, very difficult. I think, I don't think in some of the ways, some of the decisions I made, I necessarily covered myself in glory at that stage, but it was a hard time. And I think all my successors as chairman have gone through some difficult times in their own relationships with college and college council. It's really tricky. It's like you have to reinvent it every time.
Yeah, you can sometimes find yourself frozen out of decisions where during my tenure, the Royal College of GPs put out a digital roadmap, but they didn't actually show it to the Health Informatics Group until after it was published. So we were given no opportunity really to be involved in that. There's a new artificial intelligence special interest group that's sprung up, and that's not necessarily affiliated with the Health Informatics Group, not necessarily not affiliated either, but just kind of separate. And I feel as though they have to be the same thing. AI without clinical informatics is likely to be dangerous, likely to go rogue.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right. Which is partly why I also when sometimes I got quite frustrated by how difficult it was to get things done within that kind of college framework. And a few of us are very keen to sort of see if we could establish a separate faculty. Meanwhile, I was off doing a few other things. So at this kind of mid-career stage, I was off getting involved with Caldicott 2, sort of 2012 onwards.
Yeah.
So the IG side of it seemed to me to be really important. And that was, again, revisiting the whole area of to share or not to share. That is the question, almost paraphrasing Shakespeare. But it really was what constitutes a record? What's the purpose of a record? Whose record is it anyway? Because lots of people felt they had a stake in it, not just the patient and the clinician, but the centre.
Absolutely. And it's not a straightforward question. On the face of it, it's very easy to be very glib and say, oh, well, the patient owns their own record. And then when you point to them where these records are and how many different bits of record there are scattered across the NHS about you, that's a lot more complicated now. And when you say, well, if a clinician writes in your record and they need to defend themselves medico-legally using that record, do they have some ownership of this record? Does the organisation own the record? Does the NHS own the record? So there's at least like four levels at which there could be an ownership. And I genuinely don't know the answer.
I think talking about ownership stopped being helpful because it made people feel very anxious and it forced people into positions that weren't necessarily very helpful. So Fiona Caldicott and her 2013 report spent a lot of time talking about about this and about what constitutes direct care and in what ways record information could be shared. And it was amazing how often most tasks could be accomplished simply by using, how do we say this, anonymized or pseudonymized information, de-identified to a degree. But how often people insisted on having all identifiers for no very good reason, which led me on after that to working in NHS Digital as Deputy Caldicott Guardian, where one of my jobs was supervising the release of patient data sets. And as you can imagine, some of these were tens of millions of records at a time.
Yeah.
And that was fascinating time to be there, particularly in the wake of the Caldicott 2 report. So all of those things were great fun. I had the time of my life, enjoying it all very much till about 2017, when I thought it was probably time to settle back and stop. And then we kicked off with the Faculty of Clinical Informatics, which I was very proud to be a founding fellow of. And I thought, this is it. We're on our way.
Yeah.
And so I was a founding fellow, was elected to serve 2 consecutive terms on council and chaired the Education and Standard Standing Committee. And we did quite a lot of stuff when I look back on it. We set up an appraisal and revalidation system for clinical informaticians, not just doctors, though the members were overwhelmingly medical with a need for appraisal, but pharmacists and nurses too. We had a CPD accreditation program. We developed or worked on a portfolio of clinical informatics. We had a mentoring program, and we even investigated the FCI becoming a designated body for revalidation. So all of these things were some of the work we did over that 4 years. And perhaps the biggest thing was the FCI's core competency framework, which we developed and tested and rolled out, and sadly lost in the demise of the FCI a few years later. That was a huge program, the biggest thing I think I was ever involved in as a single program that I led from start to finish.
So just a huge shame about that. I've done a number of episodes on the demise of the FCI, and it always just strikes me how sad it was that the amount of effort that was put in by people who had massive amounts of experience and really wanted to pass some of that on and create a body that would do that. And just as it was kind of getting going, it was kind of tripped up by, a number of issues. No need to rehearse them here because I've done them in other videos, but it went bankrupt partly because of over-reliance on central NHS Digital England funding. And I don't think it's federated data platform paper, the position paper that it did on the federated data platform went down that well, I think.
No, I don't think it helped secure the future of the faculty. That's almost certainly true. But it was a paper that was produced at the request of council. The thing is, not all of council or all of the trustees were happy with it. And it certainly didn't make NHS England more likely to provide funding. Not that I think they ever would have done anyway, but I think it was it was, for some, I think it was an excuse. And I remember having 1 or 2 very supportive calls from people in the faculty and 1 or 2 very difficult calls as well. And it was interesting. One of the most interesting things about the FDP was the number of people we spoke to who would only talk to us off the record because they were all inside NHS England. And they were very supportive of the paper being produced. But
that in itself is worrying, isn't it? If within an organisation there's a fear of speaking up, even though there's meant to be a duty to speak up. We've actually got that from a previous health secretary, this duty to whistleblow, as it were. enshrined and you'll get protection and all that stuff, but actually people don't believe it in their own organisations. Otherwise, they would feel freer.
Well, certainly there are one or two people who were at quite, I have to be so careful what I say, but at quite a senior level in NHS England who saw every relevant draft that we wrote about the FDP, and any concerns they expressed were acted upon, and still their public comments were not supported.
Yeah, I think there was an excellent debate last week in Parliament about the federated data platform, focusing on the supplier, the contract, and the way it's being rolled out, kind of thing. And I released that as an episode, really just to edit the bit that was interesting to people out of the existing parliamentary footage. So I'll put a link to that in the description of this video, so people can go there.
Of course, the paper itself is quite dated now, so it must be at least 3 years old. But I mean, it was a piece. I was brought back to be Education and Standards acting chair during the very turbulent end game of the faculty, and I think that the disruption and disharmony at that stage was symptomatic of a much deeper malaise within the faculty, which is very sad. Once that had, once the faculty had sort of died the death, that's pretty much when I decided to step back. And
it was upsetting for a lot of people in this community, especially the ones that had put so much effort into getting it going. Do you think there's any chance that we would be able to sort of rekindle any part of it? What would you like to see happen?
I think what I liked out of it was that, well, firstly, it kind of gave me a reason for saying, hey, maybe I wasn't, I was wrong to have imposter syndrome, because that some of the projects that came out of it, like the core competency framework, helped us understand who clinical informaticians were, who we are and what we do. And it was a broad church, a big community of people in all sorts of roles. And having an organisation that is that kind of broad church was very good. But at the same time, it brought challenges, not least the multi-professional challenge, inter-professional jealousies and misunderstandings. And also within the UK setup, the Four Nations issue was a real problem. It is within the RCGP Health Informatics Group, and I think it is within Joint GPIT that the Four Nations scenario makes it very, very difficult. So we talked about earlier the good practice guidelines. They were taken up in England, mostly adopted in Scotland. I'm not entirely sure about Wales, but they weren't taken up in Northern Ireland. And there were some concerns. They said that they weren't sure that they were legal in Northern Ireland at the time. They were taken up and with a great deal of interest in, certainly looked at with a great deal of interest in Canada, Australia and New Zealand, but maybe not so much in Northern Ireland or closer to home.
Absolutely. And this is the sort of stuff that I cannot be bothered with. This kind of really small-minded infighting about territories and responsibilities and jurisdictions. And this is what attracts me to open source, you see, because I don't need to do any of that if I want to build something in open source. If I decide I want to write a set of guidelines for something, I will write them and publish them openly, and then whoever wants them can read them and use them. And they are by default global in my head, and I don't need to ask anyone's permission, and they can't stop me from doing it just because they don't agree that I have the responsibility for that patch or whatever. It's very parochial. And actually, in an internet age, we should be thinking as globally as possible anyway.
I think so, but I also don't think there isn't really a place for clinical informaticians to go, because we did talk to the GMC about whether it could be recognised as a speciality or a subspeciality, as it is in North America. there was very firm pushback on that. And so I think what's happened is that people have kind of retrenched back into their professional camps. So most of us who kind of headed off into the faculty, if we're still doing anything, we're back in the RCGP. I mean, it may not be perfect in terms of a home, but at least we can talk to a few like-minded souls. So I don't know. I think that probably it's still too raw to reinvent the faculty. And if it was reinvented, I would urge that it remained under professional leadership right to the top. I'm not sure that having external chairs who are not informaticians, chair of trustees, is a wise future course. And I don't think other Royal Colleges do that.
Yeah, the way that having I think a CEO as well, that can change how an organisation feels. And the faculty just started spending money. I was working for the faculty actually as a very low level sort of admin person. I was running the
you were in the CRM,
CRM,
yeah,
an open source self-hosted CRM that they were using, and I could see all these new staff members popping up, and I was thinking, who's paying for all this? Interesting times.
Well, I think the wounds are still probably too raw for it to be reinvented in anything like its former form. I hope that within the BCS that sort of largely adopted the faculty in a very sort of generous way, that kind of health informatics community as a multi-professional group can find a home and a voice and begin to come together. And if they can do that, they don't necessarily need to be a separate faculty anymore. But I don't know. I've stood back a little bit from that, so I'm not too sure where they are currently on their road.
It's with it being particularly a technologically forward kind of group of people, it's actually possible to imagine that they don't need an organization that looks like a traditional organization. It could actually just be a loose alliance of people that just meet on the internet, and that would enable us to teach each other about clinical informatics stuff, to build good tools and share them, to bring some of the organizational knowledge outside of the silos and share it publicly.
Yeah,
we do that anyway.
I think that's right from a kind of a lot of the kind of the stuff you can do in your own home. Some of the projects I was involved with involved partnership with universities and other big organisations, and that needed quite a lot of funding behind it and a sort of secretariat. So maybe that's also off the cards for the foreseeable future. I mean, all I'd like to be sure of is that the work that so many put into these projects over the years isn't lost.
Agreed.
And that we do retain organisational memory, because we've alluded already to the fact that even the college doesn't have a particularly good organisational memory.
Not at all.
Remember, it's got a health informatics group most of the time. So we have to have a repository for this wisdom, well, knowledge, if not wisdom, that we've built up over the years.
Yeah. One of the things I found quite effective, and me, over the past 10 years, I've run a lot of forums, and those are now starting to sort of become the repositories of that knowledge, because the Digital Health Networks, that was the first one I ran, and that's now 12 years old and doing very well. And the RCGP forums, which originally just had the Health Informatics Group in it, they are now 5-6 years old and have a good history, a sort of a level of knowledge in there that goes back a while. So you can go in there, you can search and find the decisions and the discussion from a while back. And a forum that I started a long time ago, Open Health Hub, that's another one. And they all fulfill different areas. Some are private to just certain types of groups of individuals. Open Health Hub's the one that's completely open, and that's what I'm trying to encourage people to share some of that. What would be on Wikipedia if there was enough reference material to put a citation, that sort of clinical informatics knowledge can be shared there.
Yeah.
I'd like to see more of that. That's my ambition for Open Health Hub, is that it could be a place where you could go and learn the basics of clinical informatics.
Yeah, we did have through the faculty quite a good system for accrediting courses and things, and there were lots of things we were finding out about that were going on, really good initiatives. It would be interesting to see if we could create something that kind of still had an educational component so people could learn themselves, maybe see where they are, if not on the faculty's core competency framework, at least understand the kind of areas where most people think are relevant, particularly with the world as it's changing in terms of AI that you've touched on, but robotics and genomics.
Yeah.
And there's going to be an interesting challenge. I mean, what is a medical record in the world of advanced genomics, where anything that's said about you also talks volumes about all your relatives, even the ones you don't know about?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Who will hold this genomic data? Which, of course, we might decide that we trust a government agency today to do that, but what about the government of tomorrow? And I think
what about Ancestry.com?
Yeah, 23andMe. Both of those gone out of business, and their data gets hoovered up by another organisation who buys it for the data. Anyone who had a 23andMe genome, I don't really think they can know where that data is now.
No, but there are implications. I mean, this is why I think so much of that work that came out of Caldicott was so many meetings with people like the Human Genome Project and others that were absolutely fascinating, and also the work that we did with citizen juries. These were amazing interactions with small groups of citizens, deeply immersed in topics for several days with a number of expert witnesses, and it was fascinating being part of those. Not part as I was sometimes there as an expert witness talking about medical records, for example. But again, all of these interactions you have, you come away learning so much. You're there to give advice, but actually, I know you always came away
and
the
breadth of views out there as to what they expect for a medical record, what they think is appropriate, what they think is a must do, and also what they think is absolutely appalling and must never happen. We have to ask the people what those lines are. We can't assume we know.
And there's some things that came out of that stuck with me about it. Isn't around consent, for example, consent and whether that is implied or whether it's explicit, but actually about what are people's reasonable expectations about how their health and data is used. And those, of course, change over time. What do people expect? They expect their information to be at the point of care. But what they don't expect it to be is sitting on an insurance executive's desk, for example. But it isn't always that simple. So, and particularly if you take the world of genomics, where you're going to be giving away information not just about oneself, but about relatives and people maybe in other countries and who don't have the same rights as control over their data, but you're effectively making some of their data available. So there were some really interesting ethical discussions that came out of that. And I sat back and learned a lot from a lot of people.
Citizen juries. Cool. It makes you think maybe some of the decisions that are currently made by a committee of experts should, where it covers patient data and access to data, we should be having more of a citizen jury type of approach to it, where a larger number of people are involved and there has to be consensus, and you've got to have an understanding that this is the research question is reasonable and the ethical basis is right, and that kind of stuff, because that kind of provides the defense in depth against bad actors accessing data and doing bad things with it, you can never completely reduce the risk to zero when you create the data in the first place. But you can try and insulate it, put wrappers around it, so that essentially the government of the day should not be able to help itself to the data. There has to be a mechanism to protect the data.
Well, unless citizens think that they should, if people think that that's a reasonable use of the data, then fair enough. If that's within their reasonable expectations, then okay. But if it isn't, maybe we should listen. And I think another thing that came out of it is consent isn't always necessary, but you do need to be able to inform, this is what we're doing, this is how we use your data. And that takes me back 30 years to the kind of stuff we were just beginning to do in my practice back in 1997, which attracted the attention, as I say, of Fiona Caldicott at that stage. In terms of things that I worry about, though I think you probably worry about some of them too, it's just the lack of organisational memory.
Yeah.
And we have to keep reinventing ourselves and reminding people that we're here, this community, this invisible community that holds real expertise. And that has moved on at least one generation, maybe two. And the people doing that are quite different. They're not trying to program a Sinclair Spectrum like I was. They're working with sophisticated data sets in the cloud and combining them and using AI tools and other things to do that. So, but there is still a lot to be learned and a lot to be shared. So I quite like the idea of there still being some kind of fellowship. I still think it needs to be multi-professional, because what you were as a clinician may not be relevant to what you are as an informatician, though the journey is quite common to many of us. I think education and training is a Cinderella subject. Everybody says we need it, and nobody ever pays for it. So if you're going to do this stuff somewhere, it needs to feature in an educational curriculum.
That's right. I remember having long discussions with the RCGP about where we would put more informatics in the curriculum, and this has been a standing agenda item for a decade. But the conclusion was that since informatics is now so important for everything, they would remove it as a standalone item because it's kind of involved in all the things, which is, to me, it's the intellectual equivalent of saying it's everyone's responsibility to wash the dishes, and therefore no one actually does it. It's that kind of tragedy of the commons area where no one bothers to address clinical coding, the downstream effects of bad clinical coding and what can happen. You have to just actually know that and be taught that and learn it.
You do. And I say that very much comes from the heart for me, because that was what I spent a lot of time doing. And it was about thinking about the consultation and what you're actually recording. And partly what my latest little hobby horse has been about AI recording clinical content and transcribing it into consultations. Because I feel that the consultation is part of your thought process, and the record is, coming back to our earlier discussion, it's partly whoever else's it is, it's also partly mine.
If you haven't seen it, there's an excellent Substack on this by Ben Gooch, GP. And he says exactly this, that it started off as something that he absolutely loved, this slick transcription of the consultation. Everything is written down, it's structured, it's neat. But 6 months later, when rereading one of those, he couldn't actually recognize that it was one of his consultations, because everyone has their own style in how they do the documentation. The act of reviewing it and passing it through your neurons one more time as you type it in is part of the thought process and the synthesis and the decision-making process of, did I do the right thing? So we've all had a consultation where the patient's left and you're typing it in and you go, oh shit. And you realize that you should have done something. And you run down the corridor and catch the patient because you just reprocessed all the data and thought, that is a really important thing I missed.
Well,
You know?
it's even more important for me now as I spend more time on the other side of the consultation as an old man being
Yeah.
on the receiving end of the transcribed consultation. But I think it actually speaks to you and I will have grown up with consultation models. Pendleton, Neighbour, Bailint, all of these things
Yep.
grounded our
Yeah.
understanding of what goes on in the consultation and the GP patient interaction. I think that maybe needs to be revisited and revised in the light of the way we consult now, which is a lot more like you and I are doing, or it's on the phone, or it's test first, see later. It's a different kind of world. And I'm not sure that we've got an intellectual model that matches up to that, that helps us in terms of teaching and training yet. So
And
something
it's
to
all
think
moving
about.
so fast, driven
Yeah,
by imperatives like the need to see more patients, the pressures on practices, different profiles of professionals within a practice, different
yeah,
split of professional roles. All of those changes are happening at such a speed, coupled with the technology changes, it's impossible to have a mental model. No one's writing the inner consultation um, book about 2026 because you couldn't write
yeah.
the book fast enough before it's all moved
No,
on.
no, we'd have to do it as a series of bullet points online and be prepared to change them every week. But it's a thought. I also think we need to give some thought to data collections, what they're used for. I mean, can you imagine if an LLM gets hold of a vast clinical data set? I mean, that's exactly what people do want to do with them.
Yeah.
And whether these data sets are actually assets for the use of UK PLC or not, I rather think that there are some, perhaps, I wouldn't want to misrepresent what the Blair Institute have been talking about, but I think they're very interested in the commercialisation of some of this data. And I'm coming back to our citizen juries and our patients. What do they think of that? What do they want?
Yeah, I
So,
completely agree. And there is a rush to commercialize what is seen as a multi-trillion pound asset. It's the biggest medical data store in the world, and there's lots of propaganda almost around it without really a proper consultation on who do we think owns it. And we've already agreed we don't know. It's complicated, and who should benefit from it if we did train an LLM on this medical data. Is it good enough data to train on? That's the first question. Actually, what is the data quality? Because
yeah,
anybody who's dealt with GP data and extracting it will know that some of it can be just garbage, and it contains. We've kept codes because we legally have to, but some of them are retired codes. Some of them are actually offensive, but they
yeah.
have to be left in the medical record because they're legal records.
Well, I mean, data quality was the subject of my master's dissertation,
Mm.
um, and a paper in the BMJ about it. And I still have a keen interest in the curation of the record. Who's
Yeah.
actually going to do that and take responsibility? And I think the lack of continuity of care, that ownership in a professional sense of I take responsibility for the record.
Yeah.
When I started, I had 1,500 patients. I computerised all because I looked after a branch surgery in Gargrave, 5 miles out of Skipton. I
Mhm.
had records in two places. Well, that means I have two incomplete records rather than one complete one. So I
Mm.
computerised them all onto my Sinclair QL, and found out all sorts of things about people and joined up records. And it served me well for the next 30 years, having summarised records that made sense. And record quality, I think, is absolutely crucial. And that curation aspect of that, I think, is something, again, we're at risk of losing if we haven't already lost. I don't think we can hand that over to AI or indeed to anybody else.
I don't think we can. And also LLMs, speaking as somebody who uses LLMs all day, every day to code with, if they are given very good instructions, very good context, and lots of examples, and if the data is of high quality, they will produce high quality output. But if you give them vague instructions and not enough context, they'll make up what they can't find and they'll hallucinate. And so it's absolutely critical that if we want to use AI, and I can see why there might be some benefits in the future, we have to get the data quality sorted first.
Yeah, well, I think there are those questions of continuity of care, means continuity of care of the record as well as the patient. You can't look after patients if you're not looking after their records, I think. So those are my kind of main anxieties. I think some of the things I've been involved with will survive in some form, hopefully usefully. Maybe the good practice guidelines to some degree will continue to inform some of the stuff we did with the faculty. And obviously, while I was only a bit player in the Caldicott setup, I think quite a lot of that will continue to inform decisions and discussions. And those are the kind of things I spent 30 odd years doing and having a great time doing. And as for the future, well, I think it'll be an interesting set of challenges for your generation and the one that follows. As for me, I'm more likely to be on the receiving end of it as a patient, so I'll be watching it from that side of the desk rather more than the consulting side of the desk, I suspect.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. But the stuff that you have contributed and put together with colleagues over the years, I would like to see that preserved somewhere. That I think it's very important that we don't lose this stuff, and that's one of the reasons why I sometimes do a bit of a smash and grab job, and I'll put something on GitHub, almost challenging the copyright owner to come and get me, because it's like, well, if you've got a good example is the common user interface for the NHS, which is something that it was badly conceived, but it was a good idea. Like, it should have been better than it was because of the bad execution of it. And then it was shelved. And so it's now a series of PDFs on the National Archives.
Yeah.
And there is wisdom in those documents about how to make a clinically safe medical record.
Some very bright people worked on that project.
Why have we just thrown it away?
Yeah.
Like, that needs to be made more accessible in formats that AIs can read. Because if you want them to follow CUR guidance and build you a new medical record following all that guidance, they now can. It's never been a more exciting time to be a clinician in charge of building code. But all this guidance has been buried under rubble. So I have a very strong view of that it's more important that this stuff is kept.
Well, I think that's one of the hopeful things that actually I've moaned about organisational memory. But actually, if we do upload these places to a central hub, a central store, and that is open, then I think eventually, even if they stumble across it, LLMs, I'd go to grab this stuff and maybe learn something from it, so that it isn't all us whistling in the wind over a career. So I'm very hopeful that actually new technologies will enable us to not lose those valuable insights and pieces of work that we developed together. For me, I think there are so many people who've influenced me over the years. I mentioned a few of them, but all the HIG members and chairs I worked with over time put in a huge amount of effort. And I know many, including yourself, paid quite a high price for the commitment and effort that was put in. And I think we should give a huge shout out and thanks to all the people who did those jobs. They were tough things to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And for me, I as I say, I spend most of my time now being a grandfather and roaming the Yorkshire Dales and the Lake District.
I see your photos occasionally.
Yeah. But I sometimes think about re-engaging, but I think maybe I just will continue to sit back a little bit, but contribute some of those projects.
Masterly inactivity and cat-like observation. as it was once. But to me, the catchphrase of a consultant that I used to work for.
Yeah. But I hope that you have a chance to talk to a lot of the people who I worked with over the years, and maybe to get to talk to some of those who were not necessarily would have called themselves informaticians, but definitely were. The likes of Rob Shaw, who was in Connecting for Health, and was who was the interim chief executive and an outstanding leader and fantastically supportive to me when I was there.
I'm gradually getting through them.
Yeah, make sure you do.
Through them.
I think there's a great ethicist you should maybe talk to called James Wilson at some point, who's professor in London. Fantastic guy. He'll put you in your place, make you feel that you haven't thought through things properly. He did that to me a few times. But there are plenty, and of course my whole cohort of pals from the Hig days and the meltdown days, as we used to call it in the late 90s. So I'm optimistic that the next cadre of informaticians will pick up the baton and maybe have the tools to do some of the things we didn't do. I hope they'll continue to be a multi-professional community, and I hope we can get past these artificial divides and silliness around Four Nations issues that have bedeviled us for donkey's years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Alan, that's been fantastic to talk to you, and thank you for coming on the show. Some really important points that we've covered and some good stuff to think about, to take away. So I'll make sure that I put all the links that we mentioned in the show notes. So if you've been watching, just make sure you have a look in the description. And there'll be stuff in there you can follow up on the conversations. But Alan, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.